Hi, I'm Jerry Sparks, president of AG Financial Insurance Solutions, and I have once again with me Rich Hammer, renowned attorney and general counsel for the General Council of the Assemblies of God. Welcome, Rich, and welcome to Risk Management Live. Today we're going to talk about preparing for church expansion and how a church of 100 has different needs than a church from 1,000. The Hartford Institute for Religion Research did research on all the churches. 59% of the churches in America are under 100 members. 35% of the churches are between 100 to 500. 40% of the churches are between 500 to 1,000, and only 2% of the churches are over 1,000. Although mega churches seem to be on the rise, is what they said, is what they are implying. Looking at that, the majority of our churches are under 100 people. So we're going to look at how a church of 100 has different needs than a church from 1,000. I know there's a lot of things that are the same, but as you get larger, the needs of the church change. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Rich, you want to start?
Sure. That's true. I've done, as you know, Jerry, a lot of statistical analysis, a lot of surveys of church litigation practice. And a number of years ago, I remember doing a survey that indicated at that time, and I don't think it's probably changed much, that the number one risk, or shall I say, the type of, demographically, the type of church that had the greatest risk of litigation was a church in the 500 to 1,000 attendance. So churches, I think it was actually even 500 to 750, churches of that size had the greatest risk of being sued. And I think the reason for that, I gave that a lot of thought when I did that survey. It kind of surprised me. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know why that particular demographic would be the biggest target. And I think the reason is that churches of that size, Jerry, many of them were much smaller in the fairly recent past. And there's been explosive short-term growth. Maybe that church was 100 or 150 a year or two ago. And now all of a sudden, due to programming or maybe new leadership, a new pastor, the church has grown significantly and quickly. And so the problem, of course, is when you grow quickly, is that your risk management doesn't keep pace with your growth. And so here you are, a church of 750, that all of a sudden you're exposed to a number of risks that maybe weren't that much of a concern in the past. And your risk management procedures and protocols just have not kept pace with that explosive growth.
You know, it's funny because a church of 1,000, normally you have the pastor as the leader, and that's it, a church of 100. So as your church gets bigger, you have more people to spread the work out. But unfortunately, our pastors have, with the smaller churches, which is most of our churches, they're the only person. So actually, as a church does grow, all of a sudden, the pastor's got more than he can handle, and he's got to start putting some of that work on somebody else.
That's right. And in a smaller church of 50 to 100 people, or let's say less than 100, you don't have expertise in the congregation, typically. Sometimes you do, but most of the times you don't. You do not have an attorney in the congregation in most cases. So you don't have somebody to bounce off a particular issue with that has legal consequences. And so what does that mean? You're going to have to go out and find an attorney. Maybe you're in a small town. None of the attorneys there have really any experience working with churches. I'm doing a continuing education seminar for the third time in 18 months for the Missouri Bar Association next month on legal issues and representing religious organizations. They love having me do these. In fact, I'm going to be doing two, and I've done basically these same two presentations over the last 18 months, twice. So there's just a lot of interest in that by attorneys that maybe they're members of a congregation, they get asked questions, they don't know what the answers are, or maybe they want to expand their practice and they want to develop some expertise. But the fact is, I think it really illustrates that there's a great need for legal assistance when it comes to professional assistance for any type of church. But in the larger churches, many of them are going to have an attorney in the congregation to whom they can look, but the smaller churches don't. and they're going to have to find somebody that has some expertise. Smaller churches don't have a CPA in the congregation, typically, to assist with internal controls, with financial issues, with tax issues. They don't have an insurance agent. They don't have people maybe with CPR certification to assist with swimming and any type of water event that especially the youth group or children might want to participate in. And many times they don't have anybody with a commercial driver's license that may be required for certain types of transportation needs. So smaller churches often lack the expertise internally to deal with a lot of these issues, which can expose them to greater risk.
Let's talk a little bit about what is the number one risk for a church, whether it be 100 or 1,000. Let's start with that and look at the number one risk that the church would have, and then let's see what the difference, you tell us a little bit about the difference between a church of 100 and as you move up, where those risks lie in.
Well, the biggest risk, according to my research, and by the way, I read every case in the country, all 50 states, all federal courts pertaining to religious organizations, of which there are about 12,000 cases per year that I review. And I've done this for about 20 years now, and I can tell you that the number one risk for, I think, 19 of those 20 years has been sexual abuse of a minor. Now, if you add sexual misconduct involving an adult, typically a female counselee who's counseling with the senior pastor who's a male, the relationship that ends in some type of sexual contact, if you combine those two types of sexual misconduct, it blows everything else away in terms of the number one risk that churches face. A lot of times people are not aware of this, and I did another survey on this issue, Jerry, a number of years ago, and it turned out that the churches with over 1,000 in attendance had about 5 times more probability of a sexual misconduct claim than churches of under 100. And I think there's a number of potential reasons for that. Obviously, you've got many more children involved in children's ministries, but also I think another issue would be in the larger churches, not all, but in some. I think there is what was called in the Penn State scandal involving Jerry Sandusky a few years ago was the culture of reverence. At Penn State, it was a culture of reverence for the football program. So nobody questioned Joe Paterno. Nobody questioned Jerry Sandusky, the coaches in this program. It was sacrosanct, the culture of reverence. And as a result, they lowered their guards and they tolerated risks and questionable behaviors that should have been challenged. And you see that, I think, sometimes in churches where you have a charismatic leader, a pastor who has taken that church from maybe a very small congregation to explosive growth into many hundreds or maybe thousands of people. And the church board, if there is one, they just don't want to challenge that person because of that culture of reverence. And so they ignore questionable behavior. They may ignore accusations and allegations. They resist imposing any type of accountability measures to make these kinds of activities very unlikely, to manage these risks. They're afraid of insulting their charismatic leader. So I think that's part of the reason. Now, I did a survey a few years ago on the number of churches that screen volunteers who work with minors, and I think this is interesting, Jerry.
Yep.
That I will say that the likelihood of screening volunteer workers who work with minors is much higher in larger churches. It's in fact 78% of churches over 1,000 in attendance, whereas churches of less than 100, 21% screened workers. So it's a much greater likelihood that a children's worker volunteer is going to be screened in a larger church. The fact is there are just so many more children there and many more opportunities to have access to children. And I think it's important at this stage of our discussion today to also bring in the concept of pedophilia. Pedophilia is a sexual aberration that, according to the FBI profile, is characterized by 4 4 or 5 factors. Number one, it's a sexual preference for prepubescent minors, typically under 12 or 13 years of age. It is considered incurable. It is a promiscuous behavior with the average number of victims per pedophile at about 117, according to the FBI profile. These people are predatory, and they have the highest recidivism rate of any criminal, meaning the repeat behavior. Once, if they're incarcerated and released, they're going to be right back at it, because it's their nature, it's their preference to molest children. So these people are, as I say, predatory, meaning they're constantly looking for victims. And so if you're a pedophile, what's the ideal place for you to go? Into some large facility, large congregation, where you can kind of be under the radar and maybe slip into some type of children's ministry. If you're going to be screened, that's one thing. But maybe there's things you can do hanging around without the necessity of being screened, no references. And so they gravitate toward larger churches a lot of times because of that atmosphere of anonymity. And so churches need to be vigilant. And I think some churches over the years, Jerry, have been have gotten fatigue over this issue. But you can't do that, because, as I say, for 19 of the last 20 years, the largest reason churches have been in court is sexual misconduct involving a minor. And so we got to remain vigilant. And I fear that in the smaller churches, under 100, the most common churches, with only 21% doing any screening of volunteers or work with children, that's a major concern. And why is it so low? It's because you know everybody. You know, and here's Bob. He wants to work with children's ministry. We know Bob. You know, we had Thanksgiving dinner with him. Our families sit together at the church picnic every year. And there's that sense of community that it seems so out of place and foreign to be suggesting that somebody needs to be screened. But that mentality has got to be broken. And you must, as Ronald Reagan used to say with the Soviets, you must trust but verify. And so there's got to be screening. You've got to do better than 21%. Churches of under 100 members, because this risk is the same for you as it is for the largest church. The potential valuation of one claim, and that's the universal constant here. If you have one case of child molestation, the damages, the amount you're going to have to pay out is basically is remarkably similar, whether it's a church of 10,000 or a church of 50. So in that sense, you face a staggering potential liability by failing to screen workers.
So the number one thing that churches need to do to protect those children is they need to screen and they need to check references, whether they're a church of 100 or if they're a church of 1,000. And you know, it's interesting. When I was in charge of security at one of the churches, we did have somebody that did not pass a background check. And what surprised me the most is that they actually filled out the background check information because they came back as a pedophile. And so we actually had standards where they would have to check in as soon as they got onto the premises, and I'd have somebody shadow them the whole time they were on the premises. And their point to me was, we'll just go to a church that doesn't do screening. Mm-hmm. So if you're not doing the screening and you're not doing reference checks, you're putting all of those children at risk. So that's the number one thing that if there's any takeaway from this whole entire thing, is that you need to screen your people that are working with children or that have keys to the building and have the opportunity to get a child alone.
Or any employee.
Or any employee.
Yes.
They need to screen them.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the insurance needs from a church of 100 to a church of 1,000. I know that actually you had some reference or some information in regards to how a church of 100 buys insurance a little bit differently from a church from 1,000. Why don't you share that?
Yes, I think especially the smaller churches, but I think it tends to be true for any size church. The decision to purchase insurance comes down to one thing, and that's cost. What's the cheapest policy? And that is a terrible way. I would say cost should be one factor, but it's one factor out of many, and it's of secondary importance, in my opinion. I think to me, the largest issue has to do with the greatest risk that your church faces, and that's a child molestation claim. And it's interesting that when you look at your insurance policy, you're going to see under exclusions, and that's a very important section you should be familiar with. What are risks that are not covered? What are injuries that are not covered by the liability policy? You're going to see one exclusion for intentional or criminal misconduct. And what I've seen happen in many, many of these child molestation cases is that the church receives a lawsuit for $1 million or $10 million in damages because of a case of child molestation. And the pastor turns the lawsuit over to the insurance agent, and within a week you get a no coverage letter from the insurance company, meaning we have decided there's no coverage for this claim under your policy. So on what basis? On the basis of the intentional or criminal misconduct exclusion. And the church's reaction or response is, well, how does that apply to us? We didn't do anything intentional or criminal. We're being sued because of our alleged negligence in being negligent in the selection of this worker or the supervision of this worker. We didn't do anything intentional, so how can that exclusion apply to us? There have been many lawsuits over that issue where the parties have sought what's called a declaratory judgment from a court as to whether there is coverage or not. And I mentioned to you earlier, Jerry, today that my assessment is the courts have split pretty much evenly on that issue, with about half the courts saying, yeah, we think that exclusion applies and there's no coverage for the church, even though it's being sued for negligence. That's horrible. And so I think that's the most important distinction or factor in deciding what insurance coverage or company to use is how do they interpret the intentional criminal misconduct exclusion? Does that extend to negligence claims against the church in cases of sexual molestation or abuse? That's the most important factor. And if a company says yes, that would be excluded, forget it. Move on to the next company for evaluation. To me, if I'm on an insurance committee in a church trying to evaluate intentionally and rationally the various options for insurance, that is at the top of my list in determining what company I'm going to go with.
Sounds good. Now, a lot of churches actually, as they grow in size, will have a lot more in off-premise activities. They may do some community service. They may have a camp, or they'll be sending kids to camp. They may have a July 4th celebration. They'll probably definitely have a Halloween celebration. A lot of them end up having inflatables and that sort of thing. So the more that a church has these activities, the more of a need there is to protect those. How would you, as far as coverage is, when it comes to having a limit of liability, how do you come up with a proper limit of liability to insure a church that may have assets of, let's say, $300,000 versus a church that has assets of $5 million?
Well, that is a very common question, Jerry. As you know, we get asked that question all the time. How much insurance do we need? Let's say we've gone through our checklist, we found a policy that covers sexual misconduct if we're sued for negligence. We've addressed all the exclusions, and now we're looking at a particular insurance company. How much coverage do we need? And that's a very, very good question, and there are many factors that go into that. But I generally tell churches they need to have coverage of at least equal to the net assets of the church in valuation. But the one exception to that would be sexual misconduct coverage, and we've talked about this many times. There should be probably a floor of $1 million regardless of the net asset valuation of the church.
Now, a lot of times in order for churches to get that amount of coverage, they've got to do things such as they got to tell the insurance company that they are doing background screening and they are doing reference checks. So a lot of times, unless you're doing those, you're not going to get those higher limits of liability.
That's a good point, and so be it.
So let's talk a little bit now. We have a church that's 100, but they're out of room. And either they've got to expand, go to a multi-campus, or they're going to build a new facility. So when they're getting ready to do this, they actually ought to hire a general contractor, or they're going to look at doing it themselves. We suggest that you hire a licensed and bonded general contractor. And one of the things that is very, very important is that number one, that you make sure that this general contractor has insurance. Now, this general contractor can actually work with you And you may be able to use some of your people for some of the jobs, but let him pick up the liability in case something does happen. The other thing is, sometimes in this economy, builders go belly up. They don't, they bid a job and they can't finish that job. One of the things you can do is actually ask for a completion bond from that builder to protect that job is going to be done. So that's one of the things that we can do if you're getting ready to go to a new building expansion and or if you're looking to build a new facility.
And that's a growing congregation, so we're talking about how legal risks are associated with congregational size. And obviously, in a growing, expanding church, you're going to have issues of construction because you run out of room and you go to multiple services maybe, but eventually you're going to want a new facility or an enlarged facility. And so the whole issue of construction legal issues comes into play.
Let's talk a little bit about work comp also. I know that a church that has 100 may have one pastor and one secretary. A lot of states don't require work comp, although we highly suggest that they buy workers' compensation, which would take care of their health bills if they got hurt on the job. It'd also take care of their payroll while they were on the job and any disability that happens while they're on the job. But a lot of states require workers' compensation once you get over a certain number of employees. I know the state of Missouri is 5 employees. So if you have over 5 employees, you're required by the state to have workers' compensation.
And that varies from state to state.
It does. But that's one of the things we want to, let's look at having workers' compensation for your pastors. I always tell, when I visit a church, I said, who's the most important person in this church when it comes to keeping this church going? It's the pastor. And you're not going to protect the pastor if something happens to him. Mm-hmm. So let's make sure that you have work comp. Another thing is, if once a church goes from 100 and starts growing, they end up with a church board normally. The church board previous to that may just be pretty much the pastor and somebody from the district or from the diocese or the conference that they're in. But once they get larger and they become self-sufficient, they normally will have a church board. What are some of the needs that you have when you have a church board?
Well, and that's true. And I think one of the most important things in here is to recognize that church board members are given limited immunity from liability in all states. As a matter of fact, under federal law, the Volunteer Protection Act of 1997. So church board members are given limited immunity. And what that means is they can't be liable for their ordinary negligence in performing their duties on the church board. They can only be liable for gross negligence. And I think that can happen, Jerry, in a number of ways. You utilize 15-passenger vans, especially for minors. You do not have any restrictions on the use of cell phones while driving. You don't have any type of procedure for the screening of children or youth workers. I think those are some common ways in which a church might be found to be grossly negligent. A fourth one would be the use of non-compliant cribs in the church nursery that don't meet the Consumer Product Safety Commission requirements that went into effect a few years ago for the use of cribs. And there's over 7 million non-compliant cribs that have been identified by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And if you use one of those, or more than one, in the church nursery and a child is strangled to death, that poses a serious challenge to the church. So, and let me just segue into another issue here in terms of church size. We've been talking about risks associated with size, and as a church grows and expands, not only does it have construction issues, but it also has a larger number of employees. And all of a sudden you have 5 employees, maybe 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And I think it's important to point out there's certain laws that apply to larger numbers of employers. For example, the federal Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination in any employment decision on the basis of race, color, national origin, gender, or religion, is implicated. It applies to any employer with 15 or more employees. Now, churches are exempt from the prohibition of religious-based discrimination, meaning you can discriminate in employment even if you have 15 or more employees on the basis of religion, but not on the basis of those other things, race, color, national origin, or gender. And then you have the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's triggered if you have 15 or more employees. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which protects people over the age of 40 from employment-based discrimination based on age, that's implicated if you have 20 or more employees. So as you go up the ladder in terms of the number of staff, there are different laws that begin to come into play. And I think that's why, as I do my litigation analysis every year, that employment-related claims represent the third major category of liability or litigation involving religious organizations. And that's because the larger churches trigger some of these employment discrimination laws. So I think that's very important to be familiar with that.
We actually have a question from the audience, so I'm going to go ahead and take that so we can try to always take care of our audience questions. So if you have questions, you can always ask them, and actually they do a real good job of showing right up here on this iPad. So, and this is going back because we talked about sexual misconduct, but it says, how long should a background check be good for? We have people who have volunteered with children in the past and then took a break and now want to volunteer again. Do we need to perform a new check?
Well, let me respond to that in two ways. Number one, it's interesting, the Penn State scandal I mentioned before involving Jerry Sandusky, a horrific case. But in the wake of that, the Penn State administration appointed a commission led by former FBI Director Louis Freeh to look at all of the university's procedures with regard to minors. They had all kinds of minors on that campus for youth leagues and mentoring programs, and that's how Sandusky molested all these kids. And the Louis Freeh report had 119 recommendations for Penn State. I did an article on that in my Church Law and Tax Report a few years ago. But I think one of the most surprising recommendations in that Louis Freeh report was that you rescreen youth workers every 5 years. I've never seen that before. That's one thing I really kind of question. What's the likelihood that somebody that you've screened is going to be charged with and convicted of a child molestation claim, go to prison, serve the sentence, and you're not even going to know about it? But that's the first thing to be aware of is the Louis Freeh recommendation. And this was a very competent commission by and large. It was federal prosecutors, federal judges, and so I think it was the most comprehensive treatment of protocols and procedures for risk management in this context that I've seen. But that's one I think you should be familiar with. And then the second thing that I'd recommend that you do is benchmark. And by that I mean contact other institutions that care for children, and in particular, and most importantly, that would be your local public school district, because that is an instrumentality of your state. And if you align your practice with your public schools, you're aligning your practices with your state government. And how can you be liable for negligence for violating a community standard of care? And I think this will probably vary somewhat around the country, but in many jurisdictions, there is no repeat criminal records check for a teacher, let's say, in a public school. But find out, get it in writing, if there is a requirement that teachers or employees in your local public school district have to have repeat criminal records checks, and if they don't, I think that's what should I say, a basis for you not to. I'm not saying not to do it, but failing to do it, it would be hard for me to believe that could be viewed as negligent.
One of the things that I get asked this question a lot, I say have your policy written. So if you're going to do background checks once, which that's what we normally suggest, is that you do background checks one time. If you're going to do them every 5 years, you got to do it on everybody. So, but have a written policy on what your policy is. So, and again, follow the community standards. Whatever your school district does, that's exactly what we would look at doing. So if they're doing it one time, then I would do it one time. But then as far as if they take a break, it depends on how long that break is. So if they've taken off a couple months, you're probably fine, but you could have that down. If somebody is not going to your church for a 6-month period, then they have to go through it all over again. But you can actually put that, what your policy actually is. So if somebody has worked with children in the past year and they took off less than a year, you can make that your policy.
And see what the public schools do.
And see what the public schools do. And then determine whether or not you need to run a new background check. Well, once again, we're out of time. We appreciate your time on watching Risk Management Live. Rich, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time on Risk Management Live.